A rich man fires a black woman after getting her pregnant. 24 years later, a man enters his office. The tension in Richard Collins's office was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Tyrell Grant stood before the imposing mahogany desk, his fists clenched at his sides, eyes burning with a mix of fury and long-suppressed pain. Richard, the epitome of corporate success, sat motionless, his face an unreadable mask. The silence stretched between them, years of secrets and lies condensed into this single charged moment. "You know who I am," Tyrell finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "It's time you faced the truth, Richard. Or should I call you Dad?" The word hung in the air, a challenge and an accusation. Richard's eyes widened, the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Tyrell Grant's life had been a constant uphill battle, a struggle etched into every line of his face and every callus on his hands. From the moment he could remember, it had always been just him and his mother, Amara, against the world. Their small apartment in the rougher part of town was a far cry from the gleaming skyscrapers of the business district, but it was home. Amara had done everything in her power to give Tyrell a good life, working multiple jobs, often coming home late at night with exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. But she never complained, never let Tyrell see the toll it took on her. Instead, she'd greet him with a warm smile and a tight hug, as if his presence alone was enough to wash away the day's hardships. "You're going to do great things," Tyrell, she'd often say, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and determination. "You're smart, you're strong, and you've got a good heart. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words became Tyrell's mantra, pushing him through late nights of studying, through the disappointment of scholarships just out of reach, through the odd jobs he took to help make ends meet. He was determined to make something of himself, not just for his own sake, but for his mother's. As Tyrell grew older, he began to notice the gaps in his own history, the empty space where a father should have been. When he'd ask Amara about it, a shadow would cross her face, and she'd quickly change the subject. It wasn't until he was in his teens that she finally told him the bare minimum his father had left before he was born, and that was all there was to it. But Tyrell knew there was more to the story. He could see it in the way Amara's hands would tremble slightly when the topic came up, in the faraway look that would cloud her eyes. There were nights when he'd wake up to the sound of muffled sobs coming from her room, and it broke his heart knowing there was a pain she carried that he couldn't ease. Meanwhile, across town, in a world that might as well have been on another planet, Richard Collins was living a life of luxury and power. As the CEO of Collins Associates, one of the city's most prestigious firms, Richard had everything money could buy. His home was a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood, his cars were the latest models, and his name opened doors wherever he went. Richard had built his empire from the ground up, starting as a young, ambitious lawyer and clawing his way to the top through sheer determination and cutthroat tactics. He was known for his sharp mind, his unwavering focus, and his ability to make tough decisions without flinching. To the outside world, Richard Collins was the epitome of success. But behind closed doors, in the quiet moments when the mask of the powerful CEO slipped, there was a hollowness that Richard couldn't quite shake. His wife, Catherine, was the perfect corporate spouse, beautiful, sophisticated, and always saying the right things at social events. Their son, Elijah, was following in his father's footsteps, already making waves in the business world at a young age. Yet for all his success, for all the trappings of the perfect life, Richard was haunted by a decision he'd made over 2 decades ago. A decision that he'd buried deep, covered up with layers of justifications and rationalizations. But in the dead of night, when sleep eluded him, the memory would surface: a young woman's tear-stained face, the tremble in her voice as she told him she was pregnant, the cold, calculated way he had cut her out of his life. Amara. Her name was a whisper in his mind, a reminder of the man he'd once been, the man he'd chosen not to be. He told himself it was for the best, that he was protecting his future, his career. He couldn't afford a scandal, couldn't let a mistake derail everything he'd worked for. So he'd done what he thought was necessary. He'd fired her, used his connections to ensure she wouldn't find work in the industry again. He'd told himself it was a clean break, that she'd move on, that the child, if she kept it, would be better off without him. But the guilt never quite went away. Over the years, as his power and influence grew, Richard found himself using that power in ways he never admitted to anyone. He kept tabs on Amara and the child Tyrell. He'd learned his name was. He watched from afar as they struggled, as Amara worked herself to the bone to provide for her son. There were times when he was tempted to reach out, to offer help, but pride and fear always held him back. What would he say? How could he possibly explain or justify his actions? And so he remained a silent, invisible presence in their lives, watching but never intervening. As Tyrell grew into a young man, Richard saw echoes of himself: the determination, the intelligence, the drive to succeed against all odds. It stirred something in him, a mix of pride and regret that he didn't quite know how to process. When Tyrell's application crossed his desk, the young man applying for an entry-level position at Collins Associates, Richard felt as if the past had finally caught up with him. He knew he should have rejected the application, should have found a way to cation, should have found a way to keep Tyrell at arm's length. But something stopped him. A need to see his son up close, to somehow make amends for the years of absence, even if Tyrell didn't know the truth. And so Richard Collins, the man who had everything, found himself face to face with the living embodiment of his greatest regret and his deepest secret. But as Tyrell walked into Collins Associates for his first day of work, neither man knew that their worlds were about to collide in ways that would shake the very foundations of the lives they'd built. The stage was set for a confrontation decades in the making, a reckoning that would force both Tyrell and Richard to face the truths they'd been running from, and to grapple with the consequences of choices made long ago. The pristine halls of Collins Associates were about to become the battleground for a war of secrets, lies and long-buried emotions. The morning of Tyrell's first day at Collins Associates dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions swirling within him. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time, his hands trembling slightly with a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was it, the opportunity he and his mother had dreamed of for so long. "You've got this, Tyrell," he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. The suit he wore was new, bought second-hand, but carefully tailored to fit him perfectly. It was an investment in his future, one that had required months of saving and sacrifice. As he made his way to the kitchen, the smell of coffee and toast greeted him. Amara was already up, her smile bright but her eyes clouded with an emotion Tyrell couldn't quite place. "Morning, Mum," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Morning, baby," she replied, her voice soft. "Are you ready for your big day?" Tyrell nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "As ready as I'll ever be. This is it, Mom. This is our chance to finally turn things around." Amara's smile faltered for just a moment, so briefly that Tyrell almost missed it. "You're going to do great, Tyrell. Just be careful, okay? The corporate world can be complicated." Tyrell frowned, sensing there was something more behind her words. "Mom, is everything all right? You seem worried." Amara shook her head, forcing her smile back into place. "It's nothing, baby. Just a mother's nerves. Go out there and show them what you're made of." With a final hug and words of encouragement, Tyrell set off for Collins Associates. The towering glass building loomed before him, a monument to corporate success and power. Taking a deep breath, Tyrell stepped through the revolving doors and into the opulent lobby. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, directing him to the HR department for orientation. As Tyrell made his way through the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sleek, modern interiors and the busy professionals hurrying about their day. The morning passed in a whirlwind of paperwork, introductions, and system orientations. By lunchtime, Tyrell's head was spinning with new information, but he felt exhilarated. This was the world he had always dreamed of being a part of, and now he was here. As he made his way to the cafeteria, a commotion near the elevators caught his attention. A group of executives had just stepped out, their presence commanding immediate respect from those around them. And at the center of the group was a man Tyrell had only ever seen in newspapers and on TV, Richard Collins himself. Tyrell felt his breath catch in his throat. Richard Collins was a legend in the business world, known for his shrewd decisions and unparalleled success. To see him in person was both intimidating and inspiring. As if sensing Tyrell's gaze, Richard looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Tyrell felt a jolt of something. Recognition? Curiosity? He couldn't be sure. But just as quickly as it happened, the moment passed. Richard turned back to his colleagues, continuing their conversation as they moved towards the executive offices. Tyrell shook off the strange feeling, chalking it up to first-day jitters. He couldn't shake the nagging sense that there was something familiar about Richard Collins, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The afternoon brought with it Tyrell's first real taste of work at Collins Associates. He was assigned to a team working on a major account, and despite being the newest and most junior member, he threw himself into the task with enthusiasm. As the day wound down, Tyrell was packing up his things when his supervisor approached his desk. "Tyrell, a word before you go." Tyrell nodded, his heart rate picking up slightly. Had he done something wrong? "Mr. Collins wants to see you in his office," the supervisor said, her expression unreadable. Tyrell felt a mix of excitement and apprehension wash over him. Richard Collins wanted to see him? On his first day, did. Did he say why, Tyrell asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The supervisor shook her head. "No, but I wouldn't keep him waiting if I were you." With a nod, Tyrell made his way to the executive floor, his mind racing. What could Richard Collins possibly want with him? As he approached the imposing wooden doors of the CEO's office, Tyrell took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. He knocked softly, hearing a muffled come in from the other side. As Tyrell stepped into the office, he was immediately struck by the opulence of the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and every piece of furniture exuded wealth and power. Richard Collins sat behind a massive desk, his attention focused on some papers before him. He looked up as Tyrell entered, and once again, Tyrell felt that strange jolt of recognition. "Ah, Mr. Grant," Richard said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Please have a seat." Tyrell sat, trying to keep his nervousness from showing. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Collins. I'm honored to be here." Richard studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I make it a point to meet all our new hires, especially those who show promise. Your resume is quite impressive, Mr. Grant. You've overcome a lot to get here." Tyrell felt a surge of pride mixed with a touch of unease. How much did Richard Collins know about his background? "Thank you, sir. I've been fortunate to have opportunities and support along the way." Richard nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Indeed. Tell me, Mr. Grant, what do you hope to achieve here at Collins Associates?" The question caught Tyrell off guard, but he recovered quickly. "I want to learn, sir, to grow and contribute to the company's success, and hopefully in time to make a real difference in the industry." Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Approval? Amusement? It was gone too quickly for Tyrell to be sure. "Admirable goals," Richard said. "I'll be watching your progress with great interest, Mr. Grant. I have a feeling you're going to do well here." As Tyrell left the office, his mind was reeling. The meeting had been brief but intense. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Richard Collins's interest in him than simple curiosity about a new hire. Making his way home that evening, Tyrell's excitement about his new job was tempered by a nagging sense of unease. Something about Richard Collins had felt personal, as if the man had been looking right through him, seeing something Tyrell himself couldn't see. Stepping into the apartment, Tyrell was greeted by the smell of his mother's cooking and her warm smile. "How was your first day, baby?" Amara asked, pulling him into a hug. Tyrell hugged her back, suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. "It was interesting, Mom. Really interesting." As he recounted the events of the day, including his meeting with Richard Collins, Tyrell couldn't help but notice the way his mother's face tightened, the worry lines deepening around her eyes. There was something she wasn't telling him, some secret lurking just beneath the surface. Little did Tyrell know his first day at Collins Associates had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the carefully constructed lies of the past and force both him and Richard Collins to confront truths they had long tried to bury. Weeks passed, and Tyrell settled into his role at Collins Associates. He threw himself into his work with a fervor that impressed his colleagues and superiors alike. Yet, despite his growing success, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Richard Collins's intense interest in his progress, the lingering glances, the way conversations would sometimes halt when he entered a room, it all added up to a mystery Tyrell couldn't quite solve. One late evening, as the office had emptied and the cleaning crew made their rounds, Tyrell found himself alone in the records room, searching for some old files for a case he was working on. As he rifled through a dusty cabinet, a folder slipped from his grasp, scattering papers across the floor. With a sigh, he knelt to gather them up. That's when he saw it. A photograph, yellowed with age, had fluttered out from between the pages of an old report. Tyrell reached for it, and as his eyes focused on the image, he felt the world tilt on its axis. The photo showed a much younger Richard Collins, his arm around a woman Tyrell knew all too well, his mother, Amara. They were smiling, looking at each other with an intimacy that spoke volumes. Tyrell's hands trembled as he turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, was written Richard and Amara, Summer Picnic, 1999. The year before Tyrell was born. His mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of mistake, a cruel joke. But as he stared at the photo, the pieces began to fall into place. Richard's interest in him, his mother's worried glances, the strange sense of familiarity he'd felt upon meeting Richard. With shaking hands, Tyrell slipped the photo into his pocket and left the office, his head spinning. The cool night air did little to clear his thoughts as he made his way home, each step feeling like lead. When he entered the apartment, Amara was sitting on the couch, a book in her lap. She looked up with a smile that quickly faded as she saw the expression on Tyrell's face. "Baby, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etching her features. Tyrell couldn't speak. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it out to her. Amara's face drained of color as she took it, her hands trembling. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter," Tyrell said, his voice tight with emotion. "What matters is what it means. Mom, is Richard Collins my father?" The silence that followed was deafening. Amara's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at her son, the secret she'd carried for so long finally laid bare. "Yes," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Richard is your father." The confirmation hit Tyrell like a physical blow. He stumbled back, collapsing into a chair as the weight of the truth crashed down upon him. How he managed to choke out, "Why didn't you tell me? All these years, Mom, all these years of struggling, of wondering about my father, and he's been right there all along." Amara's tears fell freely now, years of pent-up pain and guilt pouring out. "I wanted to protect you, Tyrell. Richard, he didn't want you. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me, blacklisted me from the industry. He made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with us." Tyrell's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the successful, charismatic CEO he'd come to know with the callous man his mother described. But why? Why would he do that? Amara shook her head, her voice bitter. He had his career to think about, his reputation. A child with a low-level employee didn't fit into his plans for success. So he cut us out, made sure we couldn't interfere with the life he wanted to build. The anger that had been simmering in Tyrell's chest now boiled over. And you let him? You let him get away with abandoning us, with making our lives so hard. What choice did I have? Amara cried, her voice rising. He had all the power, all the connections. I was just trying to survive, to give you the best life I could, I thought. I thought if you never knew, it would hurt less. Tyrell stood, pacing the small living room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. But now I'm working for him. He's been watching me, evaluating me. Did he know? This whole time, did he know who I was? Amara shook her head. I don't know. I never told him your name, never reached out after everything. But Richard has always had ways of finding out what he wants to know. The implications of this hit Tyrell hard. Had his entire career at Collins Associates been some sort of test? A way for Richard to evaluate the son he'd abandoned without ever acknowledging their connection? I can't believe this, Tyrell said, his voice hoarse. All those times I asked about my father, all those nights I saw you crying. It was because of him. Because of Richard Collins. Amara stood, reaching out to her son, but Tyrell stepped back, unable to bear her touch at that moment. Tyrell, please, I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but everything I did to protect you. Protect me? Tyrell's laugh was bitter. By lying to me? By letting me walk into that company blind, letting me admire the man who abandoned us? I never wanted you to feel the pain of rejection, Amara pleaded. I thought if you never knew, you could live your life without that burden. Tyrell shook his head, the anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. But I did feel it, Mom, every day, every time I saw other kids with their dads, every time I struggled to understand why my father didn't want me. I just didn't have a face to put to that pain until now. The weight of the truth settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Tyrell's mind raced with questions, with memories re-examined in this new light. Every interaction with Richard Collins now took on a new significance, every glance and word loaded with hidden meaning. What am I supposed to do now? Tyrell asked, his voice small, almost childlike in its uncertainty. Amara moved closer, her heart breaking for her son. That's up to you, baby. I can't tell you what to do, but whatever you decide, I'm here for you. Always. Tyrell nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to meet his mother's eyes. The betrayal, though born of love and a desire to protect, cut deep. He needed time, space to process this earth-shattering revelation. I need some air, he said quietly, moving towards the door. Tyrell, please, Amara called after him, her voice thick with worry. Don't do anything rash. Richard is powerful. He can. He can what, Mom? Tyrell interrupted, his hand on the doorknob. Hurt us? Abandon us? Seems like he's already done his worst. With that he left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in the suddenly empty apartment. Amara sank back onto the couch, the old photograph clutched to her chest, as she watched her son walk away, carrying the weight of a truth she'd tried so hard to shield him from. Outside, Tyrell walked aimlessly through the city streets, his mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. The bustling nightlife of the city continued around him, oblivious to the personal turmoil raging within him. As he passed storefront windows, he caught glimpses of his reflection, a young man who looked suddenly lost, searching for an identity he thought he knew. The face staring back at him was a mix of features he'd always taken for granted, never questioning their origin. But now he could see traces of Richard Collins in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. It was as if a stranger was looking back at him, a stranger with a history he was only beginning to uncover. As the night wore on, Tyrell found himself standing before the towering edifice of Collins Associates. The building that had once represented his dreams and ambitions now loomed like a monument to lies and betrayal. Somewhere in those upper floors, in a luxurious office, sat the man who had shaped the course of his life without ever acknowledging his existence. Tyrell's fists clenched at his sides, a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger at Richard for abandoning them, at his mother for keeping the truth from him, and at himself for not seeing what had been right in front of him all along. As he stood there, staring up at the gleaming windows of power and privilege, Tyrell made a decision. He wouldn't run from this truth. He wouldn't let Richard Collins continue to dictate the terms of his existence from the shadows. No, it was time for a reckoning. Time to confront the man who had given him life and then walked away. Time to demand answers, to force Richard Collins to face the consequences of his actions. With a newfound determination, Tyrell turned away from the building. He had preparations to make, truths to uncover. The next time he walked through those doors, it wouldn't be as a naive employee, but as a son demanding accountability from the father who had forsaken him. The game had changed, and Tyrell was ready to play by a whole new set of rules. The days following Tyrell's discovery were a blur of conflicting emotions and sleepless nights. He went through the motions at work, his mind constantly replaying every interaction he'd ever had with Richard Collins, searching for hidden meanings and unspoken truths. The office that had once felt like a stepping stone to his dreams now seemed like an elaborate stage for a cruel joke at his expense. Tyrell found himself watching Richard from afar, studying the man who had given him life and then abandoned him. He noticed things he'd overlooked before, the way Richard's eyes would linger on him during meetings, the slight tension in his shoulders whenever they were in the same room. It was clear now that Richard knew exactly who Tyrell was and had known all along. The realization only fueled Tyrell's anger and confusion. Why had Richard hired him? Was it guilt? A twisted desire to keep tabs on the son he'd never acknowledged? Or something more calculating, a way to control Tyrell's life from afar without ever having to face the consequences of his actions? At night, Tyrell would lie awake, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He thought about his mother, about the years of struggle and sacrifice she'd endured to give him a good life. The weight of her secret, the pain she must have carried all these years, it was almost too much to bear. He tried to reconcile the image of the strong, loving mother he knew with the young woman in that photograph, smiling, hopeful, her whole life ahead of her. How much had Richard's rejection changed her? How different might their lives have been if he had taken responsibility, if he had been a father to Tyrell? The anger that had initially consumed Tyrell began to give way to a deep, aching sadness. He mourned for the relationship he'd never had, for the father who had chosen success and reputation over his own flesh and blood. But beneath that sadness, a determination began to grow. He wouldn't let Richard Collins continue to shape his life from the shadows. It was time for answers, time for accountability. As days turned into weeks, Tyrell began to notice something else, a pattern of surveillance that went beyond casual observation. He caught glimpses of familiar faces in unexpected places, a man he'd seen in the Collins Associates lobby reading a newspaper outside his apartment building, a woman who worked in accounting coincidentally shopping at his local grocery store. At first, Tyrell dismissed these sightings as paranoia, his mind playing tricks on him in the wake of his life-altering discovery. But as the occurrences became more frequent, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. One evening, as Tyrell was walking home from work, he decided to test his theory. Instead of taking his usual route, he made a series of random turns, doubling back on himself and taking unnecessary detours. As he rounded a corner, he caught sight of a man in a dark suit quickly ducking into a nearby alley. Heart-pounding, Tyrell confronted the man, demanding to know why he was being followed. The man's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting to be caught. After a moment of tense silence, he spoke. "Mr. Collins just wants to ensure your safety," the man said, his voice low and professional. Tyrell felt a surge of anger and disbelief. My safety? He abandoned me for 24 years, and now he's concerned about my safety. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his depth. I'm just following orders, Mr. Grant. I don't know the details. As Tyrell watched the man hurry away, his mind reeled with the implications of this revelation. Richard Collins hadn't just been passively aware of Tyrell's existence, he had been actively monitoring him, perhaps for years. The next day, Tyrell couldn't concentrate on his work. His eyes kept darting to Richard's office, wondering what other secrets the man was hiding. During a company-wide meeting, Tyrell found himself studying Richard's face, looking for any sign of the father he might have been. As the meeting concluded and people began to file out, Tyrell heard his name called. "Mr. Grant, a moment please." Tyrell turned to find Richard standing there, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to discuss your progress on the Hendricks account. Would you join me in my office?" Tyrell nodded, his heart racing. This was it, a chance to confront Richard, to demand answers. But as they entered the plush office, Richard launched into a detailed discussion of the account, expertly deflecting any attempt Tyrell made to steer the conversation towards personal matters. As the meeting drew to a close, Tyrell couldn't contain himself any longer. "Why are you having me followed?" he blurted out. Richard's face remained impassive, but Tyrell caught a flicker of something surprise. Concern? In his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Grant," Richard said smoothly. "Don't lie to me," Tyrell said, his voice low and intense. "I know who you are. I know who you are to me." For a moment the mask slipped, and Tyrell saw a myriad of emotions cross Richard's face: fear, guilt, and something that might have been longing. But just as quickly, the CEO's composure returned. "I think you're mistaken, Mr. Grant," Richard said, his tone clipped. "Now, if there's nothing else about the Hendricks account." Tyrell stood, anger coursing through him. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You can't keep running from the truth." As he left Richard's office, Tyrell's mind was made up. He couldn't confront Richard directly. The man was too skilled at deflection, too protected by his position of power. No, Tyrell needed leverage, needed proof of Richard's actions and the impact they'd had on his and his mother's lives. That night, Tyrell began his own investigation. He dug through old records, reached out to former colleagues of his mother's, and pieced together the story of what had really happened all those years ago. The more he uncovered, the more his anger grew. He learned of the systematic way Richard had erased Amara from the company's history, the whisper campaign that had made it impossible for her to find work in the industry. He discovered the full extent of the hardships his mother had faced, the nights spent in shelters when they couldn't make rent, the meals skipped so that Tyrell could eat. But Tyrell also uncovered something unexpected: evidence of Richard's continued involvement in their lives, albeit from a distance. There were records of anonymous donations to Tyrell's schools, of strings pulled to ensure Amara could get jobs when things were at their worst. It painted a picture of a man torn between the family he'd abandoned and the life he'd chosen, a man who tried to ease his guilt with money and influence without ever taking true responsibility. As Tyrell delved deeper into his investigation, he felt as though he was uncovering two different versions of Richard Collins. There was the public figure, the ruthless businessman, the pillar of the community, the devoted family man. And then there was the shadow version, the man who had fathered a child in secret, who had used his power to erase that mistake, but who had never quite been able to walk away completely. The complexity of the situation only fueled Tyrell's determination to confront Richard, to force him to acknowledge the truth and face the consequences of his actions. But he knew he needed to be smart about it. Richard Collins was a powerful man used to controlling every situation. Tyrell couldn't just barge in and demand answers, he needed a plan. As Tyrell continued his investigation, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. hidden deep in the company's financial records were traces of a long-running surveillance operation. It wasn't just Tyrell who had been watched. Richard had been keeping tabs on Amara for years, monitoring her struggles, her jobs, her life. The realization hit Tyrell like a physical blow. His entire life had been observed, catalogued, and filed away in some secret archive. Every hardship, every triumph, every moment that should have been private had been laid bare for Richard Collins to see. Tyrell's anger, which had been simmering for weeks, now threatened to boil over. He wanted to storm into Richard's office to confront him with this evidence of his ongoing intrusion into their lives. But a small voice in the back of his mind urged caution. He needed more than just anger, he needed a strategy. As he delved deeper into the company's records, Tyrell began to notice discrepancies, small inconsistencies in the financial reports, odd transfers of funds that didn't quite add up. At first he dismissed them as simple clerical errors, but as the pattern emerged, he realized he might have stumbled onto something much bigger. Tyrell's skills in data analysis, honed through years of hard work and late-night studying, now came into play. He began to piece together a complex web of financial maneuvers, all carefully hidden within the legitimate business of Collins Associates. It was subtle, clever, and completely illegal. The implications were staggering. Richard Collins, the paragon of corporate success, was involved in a massive fraud scheme. The man who had abandoned Tyrell and Amara to protect his reputation was risking everything on a gamble that could bring the entire company crashing down. For days, Tyrell grappled with what to do with this information. Part of him wanted to expose Richard immediately, to watch as the empire he had chosen over his own son crumbled around him, but another part of him hesitated. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. If the company fell, hundreds of innocent employees would suffer. As Tyrell wrestled with his conscience, he found an unexpected ally. Elijah Collins, Richard's legitimate son and heir apparent to the company, approached Tyrell one evening as he was working late. "We need to talk," Elijah said, his voice low and urgent. "Not here. Meet me at the park across the street in an hour." Confused and wary, Tyrell agreed. An hour later, he found himself sitting on a park bench next to the brother he had never known he had. "I know who you are," Elijah said without preamble. "I've known for a while. And I know what you've discovered about the company." Tyrell tensed, ready to defend himself, but Elijah held up a hand. "I'm not here to stop you," he continued. "I'm here because I want to help. My father, our father, he needs to be held accountable. Not just for what he did to you and your mother, but for what he's doing to the company, to all the people who depend on it for their livelihoods." Tyrell studied Elijah's face, looking for any sign of deception. "Why should I trust you?" Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I'm tired of the lies. I'm tired of watching my father destroy everything and everyone around him in his pursuit of power and control. And because you're my brother. We might not have grown up together, but we're family. That has to count for something." As the two brothers talked late into the night, a plan began to form. They would gather evidence, build an irrefutable case against Richard, and then present him with an ultimatum: step down quietly, make amends for his past actions, or face public exposure and legal consequences. Over the next few weeks, Tyrell and Elijah worked in secret, carefully documenting every instance of fraud, every abuse of power. They reached out to trusted allies within the company, building a network of support for the changes that would need to come. All the while, Tyrell continued to play his role as the dedicated employee, watching Richard with new eyes. He saw the strain beginning to show on the older man's face, the increasing frequency of closed-door meetings with legal counsel. Richard Collins was a man under pressure, and he was starting to crack. As their plan neared its culmination, Tyrell found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about his mother, about the years of struggle and sacrifice. He thought about the father he had never known, and the complicated, flawed man he had discovered Richard to be. The anger that had driven him for so long began to transform into something else, a determination to right the wrongs of the past, to create something positive out of all the pain and deception. On the day they had chosen to confront Richard, Tyrell woke early. He stood in front of the mirror, straightening his tie, and saw in his reflection not just echoes of Richard Collins, but the strength and resilience of Amara Grant. He was their son, for better or worse, shaped by both their choices. As he left for the office, Tyrell felt a sense of calm settle over him. Whatever happened today, he was ready. He had uncovered the truth, faced his past, and forged unexpected alliances. Now it was time to shape his future and perhaps, in the process, offer Richard Collins a chance at redemption. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change not just Tyrell's life, but the fate of Collins' associates and everyone connected to it. As he stepped into the elevator that would take him to Richard's office, Tyrell took a deep breath. The time for secrets and lies was over. Today, the truth would finally come to light. The elevator doors slid open on the top floor of Collins' associates, and Tyrell stepped out, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. The luxurious corridor leading to Richard's office seemed longer than ever, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation he had been preparing for weeks. As he approached, he saw Elijah waiting by the door, his face a mask of determination tinged with apprehension. The brothers exchanged a silent nod, a world of understanding passing between them in that brief moment. "Are you ready?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tyrell took a deep breath, steadying himself. "As ready as I'll ever be." With a final shared glance, Elijah knocked on the heavy oak door. Richard's muffled voice called for them to enter, and as they stepped inside, Tyrell felt as though he was crossing a threshold into a new chapter of his life. Richard Collins sat behind his imposing desk, his face betraying a flicker of surprise at seeing Tyrell and Elijah together. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone cautious but commanding. Tyrell moved to stand directly in front of the desk, Elijah at his side. "We need to talk," Richard, Tyrell said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "About the past, about the present, and about the future of this company." Richard's eyes narrowed, darting between his two sons. "I'm not sure I understand. If this is about company business, we can schedule a proper meeting." "This isn't about scheduling a meeting," Elijah interrupted, his voice sharp. "This is about facing the truth, Dad. All of it." A tense silence fell over the room. Richard's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of fear crossing his features before he regained control. "What truth are you referring to?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Tyrell reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. He placed it on the desk, opening it to reveal documents, photographs, and financial records. "The truth about who I am," he said, locking eyes with Richard. "The truth about what you did to my mother, and the truth about what you've been doing to this company." Richard's face paled as he glanced at the documents before him. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he reached for the folder. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "That doesn't matter," Elijah said, stepping forward. "What matters is that we know everything, Dad. About Tyrell, about the fraud, all of it." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and fear. "These are complex business matters that you couldn't possibly understand." "Stop lying," Tyrell's voice rang out, filled with years of pent-up emotion. "For once in your life, just stop lying. To us, to yourself, to everyone." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Richard seemed to deflate, sinking back into his chair. For a moment he looked old, vulnerable, nothing like the powerful CEO the world knew. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Tyrell and Elijah exchanged a glance before Tyrell spoke. "We want the truth, Richard, all of it, and then we want you to make things right." What followed was a grueling hours-long confrontation. Richard, seeing no way out, began to talk. He spoke of his affair with Amara, of the panic he felt when she told him she was pregnant. He described the calculated decisions he made to protect his career, his reputation, his perfect family image. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Richard said, his voice hollow. "I told myself you'd be better off without me, that the money I sent would make up for my absence." Tyrell felt a surge of anger. "Better off? Do you have any idea what we went through? The poverty, the struggle, the nights Mom went hungry so I could eat." Richard flinched at Tyrell's words, genuine remorse flickering across his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly sorry." As the conversation shifted to the company's fraudulent activities, Richard's demeanor changed. He became defensive, trying to justify his actions as necessary for the company's survival. But faced with the evidence Tyrell and Elijah had gathered, his excuses rang hollow. "You had choices, Dad," Elijah said, his voice tight with disappointment. "You always had choices, and you chose wrong every time." As the sun began to set outside the large office windows, casting long shadows across the room, they finally arrived at the crux of the matter. "So what happens now?" Richard asked, looking utterly defeated. Tyrell straightened, his voice firm, as he laid out their demands. "You're going to step down as CEO. You're going to confess to the board about the financial irregularities and work with the authorities to make it right." Richard's head snapped up, panic in his eyes. "You can't be serious. That would destroy everything I've built." "Everything you've built on lies and fraud," Elijah interrupted. "It's time to face the consequences, Dad." Tyrell continued, his voice softening slightly. "But if you do this, if you take responsibility and make amends, we'll stand by you. We'll help navigate the company through the transition, protect as many jobs as we can." Richard looked between his two sons, seeing the determination in their eyes. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was looking at two men who were stronger and more principled than he had ever been. "And what about you?" he asked hesitantly, gesturing between himself and Tyrell. Tyrell took a deep breath, wrestling with the complex emotions swirling within him. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not sure I can ever forgive you for what you did to my mother and me. But I'm willing to try and move forward, to see if there's any relationship to be salvaged. But that depends on you, on whether you're finally ready to be the man you should have been all along." The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Richard Collins, a man who had spent his life controlling every situation, manipulating outcomes to his advantage, found himself at the mercy of the son he had abandoned and the son he had raised. Slowly, with a shaking hand, Richard reached for a pen. "Tell me what I need to do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As Tyrell and Elijah began to outline the steps Richard would need to take, a sense of catharsis washed over the room. This was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a long, difficult journey toward redemption and reconciliation. Hours later, as Tyrell finally left the office, emotionally drained but with a sense of resolution, he found himself standing in front of the large windows overlooking the city. The lights of the buildings twinkled in the darkness, a reminder of the countless lives that would be affected by what had transpired in that room. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Elijah, looking equally exhausted but somehow lighter. "We did it," Elijah said softly. Tyrell nodded, a mix of emotions washing over him. "Yeah, we did. But this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Elijah placed a hand on Tyrell's shoulder, a gesture of brotherly support that felt both foreign and deeply comforting. "It is. But whatever comes next, we'll face it together, as a family." As Tyrell made his way home that night, his mind raced with the implications of everything that had happened. He had confronted his father, exposed long-buried truths, and set in motion events that would reshape not just his own life, but the lives of hundreds of others. He thought of his mother, of the conversation they would need to have, of the healing that was still to come. He thought of Richard, the flawed, complex man who was his father, and wondered if there could ever truly be a relationship between them. But most of all, he thought about the future. For the first time in his life, Tyrell felt like he was in control of his own story. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult decisions and hard truths. But he was ready to face it, armed with the strength he'd inherited from his mother and the determination he'd cultivated through years of adversity. As he reached for his keys, Tyrell paused, looking up at the night sky. The stars twinkled faintly, obscured by the city lights, but still there, constant and enduring. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself, to his mother, and to the little boy he had once been to always seek the truth, to stand up for what was right, and to never let anyone else define his worth or his future. With a deep breath, Tyrell opened his door, stepping into his apartment and into the next chapter of his life. The confrontation was over, but the real work was just beginning. The days following the confrontation with Richard were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Tyrell. As the wheels of change began to turn at Collins Associates, he found himself grappling with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But amidst the chaos, one thing remained constant in his mind: he needed to talk to his mother. Tyrell stood outside the door of the small apartment he had called home for so many years, his hand poised to knock. He could hear the faint sounds of music from inside, a melancholy tune that seemed to mirror the turmoil in his heart. Taking a deep breath, he rapped gently on the door. Amara opened it, her eyes widening in surprise. "Tyrell? Baby, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" He stepped inside, the familiar scents and sights of home washing over him. "We need to talk, Mom, about everything." As they sat at the small kitchen table, mugs of tea growing cold between them, Tyrell recounted the events of the past few weeks. He told her about the confrontation with Richard, about the fraud at the company, and about the difficult road that lay ahead. Amara listened in silence, her face a canvas of emotions: shock, anger, sorrow, and a deep, abiding love for her son. When Tyrell finally finished speaking, she reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "Oh, my brave boy," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this alone." Tyrell squeezed her hand. "I wasn't alone, Mom. I had you. I've always had you." As the night wore on, they talked about the past, peeling back layers of pain and secrets that had been buried for so long. Amara spoke of her relationship with Richard, of the hope and love she had felt, and of the crushing despair when he had turned his back on her. "I remember the day I told him I was pregnant," Amara said, her eyes distant with memory. "I was so scared, but I thought he'd be happy, that we'd figure it out together." Tyrell felt a lump form in his throat. "What happened?" Amara's face hardened. "He looked at me like I was nothing. Like we were nothing. He said it was a mistake, that he couldn't risk his career, his future. And just like that, it was over." As she spoke, Tyrell began to understand the full extent of what his mother had endured. The sleepless nights, the endless job searches, the constant fear of not being able to provide for her child, it all came pouring out. "There were times," Amara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I didn't know how we'd make it to the next day. I remember one winter when you were about 5. The heat had been cut off, and we couldn't afford to turn it back on. We huddled together under every blanket we owned. And I told you we were having a special indoor camping trip." Tyrell remembered that night, remembered how his mother had made it seem like an adventure, hiding her own fear and desperation behind a smile and a story. The realization of how close they had come to true disaster hit him hard. "How did you do it, Mum?" he asked, awe and gratitude mixing in his voice. "How did you stay so strong?" Amara's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Because of you, baby. You were my strength, my reason for never giving up." Every time I looked at you, I knew I had to keep going, had to give you the best life I could." As the night deepened, their conversation turned to the future. Tyrell spoke of the changes coming to Collins Associates, of the difficult decisions that lay ahead. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Mommy admitted, voicing the doubts he had kept buried. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail?" Amara stood, moving around the table to wrap her arms around her son. "Tyrell Grant, you listen to me. You are the strongest person I know. You've faced more in your young life than most people do in a lifetime, and you've done it with grace and determination. You won't fail, because failing isn't in your nature. You'll stumble, you'll struggle. But you'll always get back up. That's who you are." Her words washed over him, a balm to his troubled soul. In that moment, surrounded by his mother's love and unwavering belief in him, Tyrell felt invincible. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Tyrell realized they had talked through the entire night. He felt drained, emotionally and physically, but also lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "I should go," he said, standing reluctantly. "There's so much to do at the office." Amara nodded, walking him to the door. As he was about to leave, she caught his arm. "Tyrell, about Richard." He tensed, waiting for what she might say. "I can't tell you what to do," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But remember, forgiveness isn't just for the person who wronged you. It's for you too. It's about letting go of the pain so it doesn't control you anymore." Tyrell nodded, mulling over her words. "I'll try, Mom. I can't promise more than that right now." Amara smiled, understanding in her eyes. "That's all anyone can ask, baby. That's all anyone can ask." As Tyrell made his way back to his apartment to change for work, he felt as if he was seeing the world through new eyes. The city streets, so familiar and yet suddenly different, seemed to pulse with possibility and challenge. He thought about Richard, about the long road of reconciliation that lay ahead if such reconciliation was even possible. He thought about Elijah, the brother he was just beginning to know, and the strange, fragile alliance they had formed. But most of all, he thought about his mother. About her strength, her sacrifice, her unwavering love. He made a silent vow to himself that no matter what happened with Collins Associates, no matter how his relationship with Richard evolved, he would make sure that Amara never had to struggle again. As he entered his building, Tyrell's phone buzzed with a message from Elijah. "Board meeting in an hour. This is it. You ready?" Tyrell took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He thought of his mother's words, of her belief in him. Ready, he typed back. The elevator ride to his apartment felt like a journey between worlds. He was leaving behind the boy who had grown up not knowing his father, the young man driven by anger and a need for answers. He was stepping into a new role, one that would require all of his strength, intelligence, and compassion. As he changed into a fresh suit, Tyrell caught sight of himself in the mirror. He saw his mother's determination in the set of his jaw, her kindness in his eyes. But he also saw echoes of Richard in the shape of his face, in the way he held himself. For the first time, this realization didn't fill him with anger or confusion. Instead, he felt a sense of acceptance. He was the product of both his parents, their strengths, their flaws, their choices. But he was also his own person, shaped by his experiences and his own decisions. With a final adjustment of his tie, Tyrell headed out, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was unwritten. And he was ready to write his own story, on his own terms. As he stepped out onto the street, the morning sun warm on his face, Tyrell felt a surge of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on, with the strength of his mother's love and the lessons of the past to guide him. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with tough decisions and unexpected obstacles, but for the first time in his life, Tyrell felt truly prepared to face them. He was no longer just Richard Collins's secret son or Amara Grant's boy. He was Tyrell Grant, a man forged by adversity, strengthened by love, and ready to shape his own destiny. With each step toward Collins Associates, Tyrell felt the weight of his past lightening, replaced by the promise of the future. The truth had been revealed, the confrontation had happened, and now it was time to move forward. Whatever came next, he would face it with courage, integrity, and the unshakable knowledge that he was not alone. As the towering edifice of Collins Associates came into view, Tyrell took a deep breath. This was more than just a building now, it was the battleground where he would fight for justice, for redemption, and for a future built on truth rather than lies. With his head held high and his mother's words echoing in his heart, Tyrell walked through the doors, ready to begin the next chapter of his extraordinary journey. As Tyrell stepped into the bustling lobby of Collins Associates, he felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. News of the impending board meeting had spread like wildfire, and speculation was rife among the employees. He made his way to the elevator, his face a mask of calm determination, even as his heart raced within his chest. The ride to the top floor seemed to take an eternity. When the doors finally opened, Tyrell found Elijah waiting for him, his face etched with concern. "You ready for this?" Elijah asked, his voice low. Tyrell nodded, squaring his shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be." Together they walked towards the boardroom, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the hushed corridor. As they approached, they saw Richard standing outside, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a look of apprehension. "Boys," Richard said, his voice strained. "Before we go in there, I need to talk to you." Tyrell and Elijah exchanged a wary glance. "What is it?" Tyrell asked, his guard up. Richard took a deep breath, his eyes darting between his two sons. "I've been thinking about what you said about making things right, and I've made a decision." Before he could continue, the boardroom door opened, and a stern-faced woman peered out. "Mr. Collins, we're ready for you now." Richard nodded, then turned back to Tyrell and Elijah. "Just follow my lead in there, okay?" With a sense of trepidation, Tyrell and Elijah followed Richard into the boardroom. The atmosphere was tense, with board members murmuring amongst themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. As Richard took his place at the head of the table, Tyrell and Elijah stood to the side, unsure of what was about to unfold. Richard cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Richard began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "I've called this emergency meeting because there are some truths that need to be addressed. Truths about this company, and about myself." Tyrell felt his pulse quicken. Was Richard really going to come clean? "For years," Richard continued, "I've led this company with a single-minded focus on success and growth. But in that pursuit, I've made choices that I'm not proud of, choices that have hurt people, including my own family." A ripple of whispers swept through the room. Richard pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "I'm here today to take responsibility for those choices, to admit that in my drive for success, I've compromised the very values this company was built upon." As Richard spoke, laying bare the financial irregularities and ethical breaches that had plagued the company, Tyrell watched the faces of the board members. Shock gave way to anger, then to a grim sort of resolution. But just as it seemed Richard was about to reveal everything, he paused, his eyes meeting Tyrell's across the room. In that moment, Tyrell saw something he'd never seen in his father's eyes before: fear. "The truth is," Richard said, his voice suddenly faltering, "the responsibility for these actions lies solely with me. My sons, Tyrell and Elijah, they discovered these irregularities and brought them to my attention. They're the ones who convinced me to come forward, to make things right." Tyrell felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. This wasn't what they had agreed upon. Richard was taking all the blame, shielding them from any potential fallout. As the board erupted into chaos, demanding explanations and calling for immediate action. Tyrell found himself torn. Part of him wanted to speak up, to tell the whole truth. But another part recognized the sacrifice Richard was making, the first truly selfless act he'd witnessed from his father. The next few hours passed in a blur of raised voices, hastily called lawyers, and frantic phone calls. By the time the dust began to settle, it was clear that Richard's tenure as CEO of Collins Associates was over. The board had voted for his immediate removal, pending a full investigation into the company's finances. As the board members filed out, their faces grim and determined, Tyrell approached Richard, who sat slumped in his chair, looking every bit his age. "Why did you do that?" Tyrell asked, his voice a mix of confusion and grudging respect. "Why take all the blame?" Richard looked up, his eyes tired but clear. "Because it's the truth, isn't it? All of this, it's my fault. My choices, my mistakes. It was time I faced the consequences." Elijah joined them, his expression unreadable. "What happens now, Dad?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Now I cooperate fully with the investigation. I do whatever it takes to make this right, to protect the company and the people who work here." As the reality of the situation sank in, Tyrell found himself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The anger and resentment that had driven him for so long were still there, but they were tempered now by something else, a grudging respect for the man who had finally chosen to do the right thing, even at great personal cost. The three men sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the day's events hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice soft but determined. "Tyrell, Elijah, I know I have no right to ask this of you, but the company is going to need strong leadership to weather this storm. Will you stay? Help guide Collins Associates through this transition." Tyrell and Elijah exchanged a long look, years of shared and separate experiences passing between them in that silent communication. "We'll stay," Elijah said finally, speaking for both of them. "Not for you, Dad, but for the people who depend on this company, for the legacy that's bigger than any one person's mistakes." Richard nodded, a flicker of relief passing across his face. "Thank you. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it." As they prepared to leave the boardroom to face the storm of questions and speculation that surely awaited them outside, Tyrell felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This wasn't the resolution he had imagined, but perhaps it was the one they needed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. News of Richard's resignation and the impending investigation sent shockwaves through the business world. Tyrell and Elijah found themselves thrust into the spotlight, working tirelessly to stabilize the company and reassure panicked employees and investors. But through it all, Tyrell was surprised to find a growing bond with Elijah. They were different in many ways, shaped by their vastly different upbringings, but they shared a common goal and a newfound respect for each other. One evening, as they worked late in what had once been Richard's office, Elijah broke the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I always wondered what it would be like to have a brother. I just never imagined it would happen like this." Tyrell looked up from the report he was reading, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Elijah nodded, his expression turning serious. "Tyrell, I want you to know, I'm sorry for everything you and your mother went through. If I had known—" "You didn't know," Tyrell interrupted gently. "None of this is on you, Elijah." A moment of understanding passed between them, another step in the complex dance of their newfound relationship. As the weeks passed, Tyrell found himself settling into his new role at Collins Associates. The work was challenging, often overwhelming, but he approached it with the same determination that had carried him through years of adversity. He thought often of his mother during this time, of the strength she had shown in raising him alone. Her words of encouragement were a constant presence in his mind, pushing him forward when the task seemed insurmountable. And then, just as it seemed they were starting to find their footing, another bombshell dropped. Tyrell was working late one night when his phone rang. It was Elijah, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Tyrell, you need to come to the hospital. It's Dad. He's had a heart attack." The hospital corridor was a stark contrast to the polished halls of Collins Associates. The harsh fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow, and the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair. Tyrell's footsteps echoed as he hurried towards the waiting area, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He found Elijah pacing, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled, worry etched deep into his features. Catherine sat nearby, her face pale and drawn, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "How is he?" Tyrell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Richard that it made Tyrell's heart clench. "They're still with him." It was bad, Tyrell. "They're not sure if he's going to make it." The words hung heavy in the air, the reality of the situation sinking in. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of anger and resentment, Tyrell felt a surge of fear at the thought of losing Richard now, just when they were finally starting to unravel the tangled web of their relationship. Catherine looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Tyrell," she said softly, "I'm glad you're here. I know things have been complicated, but Richard would want you here." But Tyrell nodded, unable to find the words to respond. He sank into a chair, the events of the past few weeks crashing over him like a tidal wave. How had they gone from confrontation to cooperation to this? As the hours ticked by, the waiting room became a crucible of raw emotion. Elijah continued his restless pacing, while Catherine sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the door, as if willing it to open with good news. Tyrell found himself lost in thought, memories of his childhood mingling with recent events in a dizzying kaleidoscope. He thought of the times he'd longed for a father, of the anger that had fueled him for so long. He thought of the look in Richard's eyes when he'd taken responsibility for his actions in the boardroom, and of the tentative steps they'd taken towards some kind of reconciliation in the weeks that followed. Just as the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him, Tyrell felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see his mother, Amara, standing there, her eyes filled with concern and love. "Mom," he said, surprise momentarily overriding everything else. "What are you doing here?" Amara sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Elijah called me," he thought. "He thought you might need me." Tyrell glanced at his brother, who gave a small nod before resuming his pacing. The gesture, so thoughtful and unexpected, brought a lump to Tyrell's throat. "How are you holding up?" baby Amara asked softly. Tyrell shook his head, struggling to articulate the storm of emotions within him. "I don't know, Mum. I'm angry and scared and confused, all at once. I spent so long hating him, and now." "And now you're afraid of losing him before you've had a chance to really know him," Amara finished, her voice gentle. "Is that crazy?" Tyrell asked, feeling suddenly like a lost child rather than the confident businessman he'd become. Amara squeezed his hand. "No, baby, it's human. Love and hate, they're two sides of the same coin. Both come from a place of caring, of connection." As Tyrell absorbed his mother's words, the door to the waiting room opened. A doctor entered, his face grave. Everyone tensed, bracing for news. "Mr. Collins has stabilized," the doctor said, his voice calm and professional. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but he's fighting." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Catherine began to sob quietly, years of tension finally breaking. Elijah moved to comfort her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Tyrell felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest, only to be replaced by a new kind of tension. Richard was alive, but what did that mean for their fragile, newly forming relationship? As the initial relief faded, practical concerns began to surface. The company was still in turmoil, and Richard's health crisis would only add to the uncertainty. Tyrell and Elijah exchanged a look, both realizing the challenges that lay ahead. "We need to make a statement," Elijah said, his business instincts kicking in despite the emotional situation. "Reassure the board, the employees, the shareholders." Tyrell nodded, grateful for something concrete to focus on. "I'll draft something. We'll present a united front, emphasize that the company is in good hands." As they discussed the practicalities, Tyrell became aware of Amara and Catherine, watching them with a mixture of pride and sadness. These two women, so different in their experiences yet bound by their connection to Richard, represented the complex legacy he had created. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital visits, press conferences, and late-night strategy sessions. Tyrell and Elijah worked tirelessly, balancing their concern for their father with their responsibilities to the company. They presented a united front to the world, their newfound brotherhood a source of strength in the face of adversity. Richard drifted in and out of consciousness, his moments of lucidity brief but impactful. During one such moment, Tyrell found himself alone with his father, the beeping of medical equipment a constant reminder of how precarious the situation was. "Tyrell," Richard said, his voice weak but clear, "I'm sorry. For everything." Tyrell felt a surge of emotion, years of hurt and anger warring with a newfound understanding. "I know, Dad. I know. Richard's hand, once so strong and assured, now frail and covered in tubes, reached out. Tyrell took it, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "I was a coward," Richard continued, each word seeming to cost him great effort. "I let fear dictate my actions, and I hurt the people I should have protected. You, your mother. I can never make that right." Tyrell swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "You're trying now. That counts for something." A ghost of a smile flickered across Richard's face. "You're a better man than I ever was, Tyrell. You and Elijah both. The company, it's in good hands with you two." Before Tyrell could respond, Richard's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion overtaking him once more. Tyrell sat there for a long time, holding his father's hand, lost in thought. When he finally emerged from the hospital room, he found Elijah waiting, concern etched on his face. "How is he?" Elijah asked. Tyrell ran a hand over his face, suddenly feeling the weight of the past few days. "Hanging in there, he talked about us, about the company." Elijah nodded, understanding the unspoken implications. "We need to start thinking long-term, Tyrell. About the future of Collins Associates, about our roles in it." As they walked down the corridor, discussing possibilities and challenges, Tyrell felt a strange sense of déjà vu. How many times had Richard and his board members had similar conversations, making decisions that would affect countless lives? But this time was different. This time, the decisions would be made with a full understanding of their impact, with a commitment to integrity that had been missing for too long. As they reached the hospital lobby, they found Amara and Catherine deep in conversation. The sight gave Tyrell pause. These two women, once divided by Richard's choices, now seemed to be finding common ground in their shared concern for him and their sons. "Mom," Tyrell called out, curious about this unexpected development. Amara looked up, a soft smile on her face. "Tyrell, Elijah, Catherine and I were just talking about you boys, about how proud we are of how you're handling everything." Catherine nodded in agreement. "You've shown remarkable strength and unity. It's what Richard should have done all those years ago." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Tyrell and Elijah exchanged a glance, both recognizing the healing that was taking place, not just for them, but for their mothers as well. As they left the hospital that evening, Tyrell felt a shift in the air, a sense that they were on the cusp of something new. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with challenges both personal and professional. but for the first time he felt truly equipped to face those challenges. He had a brother at his side, a mother whose strength continued to inspire him, and a father who, despite his many flaws, had finally begun the journey towards redemption. The Collins legacy, once built on secrets and lies, was being rebuilt on a foundation of truth and integrity. As Tyrell drove home, the city lights blurring past his window, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The angry young man who had started this journey, driven by a need for answers and justice, seemed like a distant memory. In his place was someone new, someone tempered by forgiveness, strengthened by understanding, and ready to shape his own destiny. The future of Collins Associates and of the Collins family was far from certain, but Tyrell was no longer afraid of that uncertainty. He was ready to face it head-on, with the lessons of the past as his guide and the promise of a better tomorrow as his goal. As he pulled up to his apartment building, Tyrell's phone buzzed with a message from Elijah. Board meeting tomorrow. Ready to shape the future. Tyrell smiled, typing out his response. Ready. Together. With those words, Tyrell stepped out of his car and into the cool night air, ready to face whatever challenges the new day might bring. The story of the Collins family was far from over, but for the first time it felt like they were all on the same page, writing a new chapter together. The boardroom at Collins Associates was filled with a palpable tension as Tyrell and Elijah took their seats at the head of the table. The faces of the board members reflected a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and barely concealed skepticism. After all, the company had been rocked by scandal, its longtime CEO was in the hospital, and now two young men brothers who had been strangers just months ago were proposing to lead the company into a new era. Tyrell cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We know that recent events have shaken the very foundation of Collins Associates. Today we're here to discuss not just damage control, but a complete reimagining of what this company can be. Elijah picked up seamlessly where Tyrell left off, their newfound synchronicity on full display. We've spent the last few weeks going through every aspect of the company's operations. What we've found is both troubling and inspiring. There's no denying that mistakes were made, serious ones, but we've also discovered a wealth of untapped potential. Innovative ideas that were shelved in favor of short-term gains. As they laid out their vision for the future of Collins Associates, Tyrell could see the doubt in some board members' eyes slowly being replaced by interest, even excitement. They proposed a radical restructuring of the company, emphasizing ethical business practices, employee welfare, and sustainable growth. However, just as it seemed they were making headway, a voice cut through the discussion. "This all sounds very noble," said Harrison Wells, one of the oldest and most conservative board members. "But let's be realistic. These changes you're proposing, they'll cost us. Shareholders won't stand for it. We'll be decimated in the market." Tyrell felt a flicker of doubt, but before he could respond, Elijah stepped in. "Mr. Wells, with all due respect, that kind of short-term thinking is exactly what led us to this crisis. Yes, these changes will have a cost, but the cost of not changing, that's far greater." Tyrell nodded, building on his brother's point. "We're not just talking about financial costs. We're talking about the cost to our reputation, to the trust of our employees and customers. If we don't make these changes, there might not be a Collins Associates to worry about in 5 years." The room fell silent as the weight of their words sank in. Tyrell and Elijah exchanged a glance, knowing they were at a crucial tipping point. Suddenly, the boardroom door opened, and a figure stepped in, causing a collective gasp. It was Richard Collins, pale and leaning heavily on a cane, but very much alive and present. "Dad!" Elijah exclaimed, half rising from his seat. "What are you doing here? You should be in the hospital." Richard waved off their concern, making his way slowly to an empty chair. "I heard there was an important meeting. Couldn't miss it." Tyrell felt a mix of emotions, concern for Richard's health, anxiety about how his presence would affect the meeting, and a strange sense of relief at seeing him there. Richard looked around the table, his gaze finally settling on Tyrell and Elijah. "Please continue. I'm just here to listen." With a deep breath, Tyrell resumed their presentation. As he spoke, he could feel Richard's eyes on him, but for once the scrutiny didn't make him uncomfortable. Instead, it fueled him, pushing him to articulate their vision with even more passion and conviction. As they concluded their proposal, the room erupted into discussion. Board members debated the merits and risks of the plan, voices rising and falling in a cacophony of corporate discourse. Through it all, Richard remained silent, his expression unreadable. Finally, as the debate reached a fever pitch, he slowly stood, leaning heavily on his cane. The room fell silent immediately. "I've sat at this table for over 3 decades," Richard began, his voice weak but determined. "I've made decisions that shaped this company for better and for worse, but never, in all those years, have I been as proud as I am right now." He turned to face Tyrell and Elijah, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "These young men, my sons, have shown us a vision of what Collins Associates can be, what it should be. A company built not just on profit, but on principles, on integrity." Richard's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of each board member. "I know some of you have doubts. Change is always frightening. But I'm telling you now, as the founder of this company, and as someone who has seen the consequences of putting profit before people, this is the only way forward." With those words, Richard Collins, the man who had built an empire on cunning and often cutthroat business practices, gave his unequivocal support to a plan that prioritized ethics over easy profits. The impact was immediate and profound. Board members who had been wavering now nodded in agreement. Those who had been opposed fell silent, the weight of Richard's endorsement too significant to ignore. As the meeting adjourned with a tentative agreement to move forward with Tyrell and Elijah's plan, the brothers found themselves alone with their father. "That was quite a speech," Tyrell said, still processing what had just happened. Richard smiled wryly. "Well, I may be old and sick, but I still know how to work a room." His expression turned serious. "I meant every word, though. What you two are proposing, it's brave. It's right. It's right. It's what I should have done years ago." Elijah helped Richard to his feet. "We couldn't have done it without you, Dad. Your support in there, it made all the difference." As they made their way out of the boardroom, Tyrell felt a strange sense of completion. The confrontation he had dreamed of for so long had evolved into something he never could have imagined: a collaboration, a chance to reshape not just his own future, but the future of hundreds of employees and thousands of customers. However, their moment of triumph was short-lived. As they reached the elevator, Richard suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. Before Tyrell or Elijah could react, he collapsed. The next few hours were a blur of ambulance sirens, hospital corridors, and anxious waiting. When the doctor finally emerged from the emergency room, his face was grave. "I'm sorry," he began, and Tyrell felt the world tilt on its axis. "We did everything we could, but the strain was too much for his heart. Mr. Collins has passed away." The words hit Tyrell like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through, after finally starting to build a relationship with his father, it was over. Richard Collins was gone. As Elijah broke down, sobbing quietly, Tyrell found himself in a strange state of numbness. He thought of the young boy who had longed for a father, of the angry young man who had sought confrontation, and of the person he had become, someone who had started to understand and even forgive the complicated man who was his father. In that moment of grief and shock, Tyrell realized that the story of Collins Associates and of the Collins family was far from over. In fact, it was entering a new chapter, one that he and Elijah would have to write without their father's guiding hand. As they left the hospital, stepping into a world that felt irrevocably changed, Tyrell made a silent vow. He would honor Richard's final act, his support for a more ethical, responsible company. He would work alongside Elijah to build something their father could have been truly proud of. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles they couldn't yet foresee. But as Tyrell looked at his brother, saw the same determination reflected in Elijah's tear-stained face, he knew they would face it together. The Collins legacy, born in secrets and redeemed in truth, would live on. And Tyrell, the son who had once been a secret himself, would be at the forefront, shaping that legacy into something worthy of the sacrifices that had been made along the way. The weeks following Richard Collins' funeral were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Tyrell and Elijah. The brothers found themselves thrust into the spotlight, not just as the new leaders of Collins Associates, but as the subjects of intense media scrutiny. The story of the secret son, the family reunion, and the dramatic boardroom confrontation had captured the public's imagination, turning what should have been a private time of mourning into a public spectacle. Tyrell stood at the window of his new office, gazing out at the city skyline. The view was impressive, but it felt hollow somehow, a constant reminder of the complex legacy he had inherited. He thought back to his first day at Collins Associates, how he had looked up at this very building with a mix of anticipation and determination. Now, standing at the top, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Elijah entered, his face showing the strain of the past few weeks. "The Puerto Rico team's here," he said, his voice tired but resolute. "They want to go over the press statement for tomorrow's announcement." Tyrell nodded, turning away from the window. "Let's get this over with." As they sat through the meeting, discussing the best way to present their vision for the company's future, Tyrell found his mind wandering. He thought of his mother, Amara, and how she had reacted to the news of Richard's death. There had been sadness there, certainly, but also a sense of closure. "It's the end of an era," she had said, her eyes distant with memories. The Puerto Rico team's voices faded into background noise as Tyrell grappled with the enormity of the task ahead. They weren't just restructuring a company, they were attempting to reshape its very DNA, to transform a corporate giant built on cutthroat tactics into an ethical, sustainable enterprise. And they had to do it all under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. As the meeting concluded and the PR team filed out, Elijah turned to Tyrell, concern etched on his face. "You okay? You seemed a million miles away in there." Tyrell sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just thinking about everything we're up against. The board's still not fully on board with all our proposals, the shareholders are nervous, and now we've got the media breathing down our necks. Sometimes I wonder if we're in over our heads." Elijah nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, it's overwhelming. But remember why we're doing this, Ty. It's not just about turning a profit or saving face. It's about making things right. About building something we can be proud of." As Elijah spoke, Tyrell felt a surge of gratitude for his brother. In the short time they'd known each other, they'd forged a bond that went beyond shared DNA. They were partners in this endeavor, united in their desire to redeem the Collins name. "You're right," Tyrell said, straightening up. "We can do this. We have to do this." As they left the office that evening, stepping into the cool night air, Tyrell felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But they were ready to face those challenges head-on together. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tension that filled the Collins Associates lobby. Employees huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz of anticipation. Today was the day Tyrell and Elijah would officially announce their plans for the company's future, and everyone was on edge. Tyrell adjusted his tie as he and Elijah rode the elevator to the ground floor. They had decided to make the announcement in the lobby, a symbolic gesture of transparency and inclusivity. As the doors opened, Tyrell took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The brothers made their way to the small podium that had been set up, flanked by a forest of microphones and camera lenses. Tyrell could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them, employees, journalists, and curious onlookers who had gathered outside the building's glass facade. Elijah stepped up to the microphones first, his voice steady as he began to speak. "Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. As you know, Collins Associates has been through a period of significant upheaval. Today, my brother Tyrell and I want to talk to you about where we go from here." As Elijah continued, outlining the broad strokes of their plan, Tyrell watched the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, skepticism, curiosity, and fear all mingled together. These people's livelihoods depended on the decisions he and Elijah were making. The responsibility was enormous. When it was Tyrell's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice clear. "Collins Associates has a long and complex history," he began. "Some of that history is a source of pride, and some of it we're not so proud of. But today, we're not here to dwell on the past. We're here to talk about the future." As Tyrell laid out their vision for a more ethical, sustainable company, he could feel the energy in the room shifting. The initial tension began to give way to a cautious optimism. When he spoke about their plans to prioritize employee welfare and community engagement, he saw nods of approval and even a few smiles. "We know this won't be easy," Tyrell concluded. "Change never is, but we believe in the people of Collins Associates. We believe in your creativity, your dedication, and your integrity. Together we can build a company that not only succeeds in the marketplace, but makes a positive impact on the world." As the applause filled the lobby, Tyrell felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had taken the first step, made their intentions clear to the world. Now came the hard part, turning those words into action. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and late nights poring over financial reports. Tyrell and Elijah threw themselves into the work, determined to make good on their promises. They assembled a team of like-minded executives, people who shared their vision for a more ethical business model. But as they delved deeper into the company's operations, they began to uncover layers of complexity they hadn't anticipated. The reach of Richard's questionable business practices extended further than they had realized, touching almost every aspect of the company's operations. One evening, as they sat in Tyrell's office surrounded by stacks of reports, Elijah leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "You know, there are moments when I almost understand why Dad did what he did. The pressure to keep this machine running, to keep profits up, it's relentless." Tyrell nodded, understanding all too well. "I know. But that's exactly why we have to change things. We can't keep operating like this, always chasing the next quarter's numbers at any cost." As they talked late into the night, brainstorming solutions and debating strategies, Tyrell felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about redeeming their father's legacy anymore. It was about creating something new, something that could serve as a model for other companies. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, changes began to take root at Collins Associates. They implemented new policies on ethical sourcing, invested in employee development programs, and launched initiatives to reduce the company's environmental impact. Not everything went smoothly, of course. There were setbacks and mistakes, moments of doubt and frustration. Some longtime executives resistant to change left the company. Shareholders grumbled about short-term profit losses. But Tyrell and Elijah stood firm, buoyed by the growing support from employees and an increasingly positive public perception. 1 year after Richard's death, Tyrell found himself once again standing at the window of his office, looking out over the city. So much had changed, and yet in many ways the view remained the same. The skyline was still dominated by towers of glass and steel, monuments to corporate power and ambition. But Tyrell knew that behind those gleaming facades something was shifting. Collins Associates was no longer just another faceless corporation. They were becoming known as innovators, as a company that prioritized ethics alongside profits. Other businesses were starting to take notice, to ask questions about how they too could adopt more sustainable practices. A knock at the door pulled Tyrell from his thoughts. He turned to see Elijah entering, a smile on his face. "You ready?" "The board's waiting." Tyrell nodded, straightening his tie. Today was another big day. They were presenting their first-year results to the board. The numbers weren't as high as they had been in previous years, but they were solid, and more importantly, they had been achieved without compromising their new ethical standards. As they walked to the boardroom, Tyrell thought about how far they had come. He thought about Richard, about the complicated man who had been his father. He wondered what Richard would think of what they had accomplished, of the company Collins Associates was becoming. The board meeting was intense but ultimately successful. There were tough questions, certainly, but also nods of approval and even a few congratulations. As they left the boardroom, Elijah clapped Tyrell on the shoulder. "We did it, bro. We're really doing this." Later that evening, as Tyrell was preparing to leave the office, his phone rang. It was his mother, Amara. "Hey, Mom," he answered, a smile in his voice. "Hello, my brave boy," Amara said warmly. "I saw the news about the company's results. I'm so proud of you, Tyrell, of both you and Elijah." Tyrell felt a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you, you know. Everything you taught me, everything you sacrificed." "Oh," Tyrell, Amara said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've taken those lessons and done more than I ever could have dreamed. You're changing things, baby. You're making a real difference." As he hung up the phone, Tyrell felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still long, still challenging, but he knew now that he was on the right path. He and Elijah were writing a new chapter in the Collins story, one that honored the best of their father's legacy while correcting its mistakes. Tyrell gathered his things and headed for the elevator. As he rode down to the lobby, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the angry young man seeking answers to the leader he had become, it had been a transformation he never could have anticipated. Stepping out into the cool evening air, Tyrell looked up at the Collins Associates building. Once, it had seemed like a symbol of everything he resented: power, privilege, secrets. Now, it represented something else: possibility, redemption, hope. As he walked home through the bustling city streets, Tyrell felt a sense of excitement for what the future might hold. He and Elijah had taken the first steps towards transforming Collins Associates. Now the real work was just beginning. There would be more challenges to face, more obstacles to overcome. But Tyrell was ready for them. He thought about Richard, about the complex relationship they had barely begun to explore before it was cut short. There was still pain there, still unresolved feelings. But there was also gratitude for the opportunity Richard had given him, however unintentionally, to make a real difference in the world. Tyrell's phone buzzed with a message from Elijah Drinks to celebrate. "Amara and Catherine are in if you are." Tyrell smiled, typing out a quick response: "Absolutely. On my way." As he changed direction, heading towards the restaurant where his newfound family waited, Tyrell felt a surge of optimism. The Collins legacy was no longer defined by secrets and lies. It was being reshaped day by day into something honorable, something meaningful. And Tyrell, once the secret son, was now at the forefront of that change. He was no longer seeking a place to belong. He had created one, not just for himself, but for everyone touched by Collins Associates. The future was uncertain, but it was bright with possibility, and Tyrell was ready to face it head-on, with his family by his side and the lessons of the past to guide him. The story of Collins Associates and of Tyrell Grant was far from over, but in fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. As Tyrell entered the restaurant, he was greeted by the warm smiles of his family. Elijah stood to embrace him, while Amara and Catherine waved from their seats. The sight of them all together, united despite their complicated history, filled Tyrell with a sense of wonder and gratitude. "There he is, the man of the hour," Elijah exclaimed, clapping Tyrell on the back. Tyrell laughed, shaking his head. We're both the men of the hour, brother. This is a team effort, remember." As they settled into their seats, the conversation flowed easily, touching on the day's successes and the challenges that lay ahead. Tyrell found himself marveling at how natural it all felt, this family dinner that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Amara reached across the table, squeezing Tyrell's hand. "I can't tell you how proud I am seeing you two work together like this. It's more than I ever could have hoped for." Catherine nodded in agreement. "Richard would be proud too," she said softly. "I know things were complicated, but he always admired strength and integrity. You boys have shown both in spades." But the mention of Richard brought a momentary hush to the table. Even now, his presence, or rather, his absence, was keenly felt. Elijah raised his glass. "To Dad," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "for giving us the opportunity to do better." They all raised their glasses, the quiet clink echoing with unspoken feelings: regret, forgiveness, hope. As the evening wore on, Tyrell found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The anger that had once driven him seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. Later, as they were preparing to leave, Elijah pulled Tyrell aside. "I've been thinking," he said, his expression serious, "about the future of Collins Associates, about our role in it." Tyrell nodded, encouraging him to continue. "We've made great strides," Elijah went on, "but there's so much more we could do. I've been looking into some of the cutting-edge research on sustainable business practices, and I think we have a real opportunity to be pioneers in this field." Tyrell felt a surge of excitement. "What did you have in mind?" As Elijah outlined his ideas, a complete overhaul of their supply chain, investments in renewable energy, a radical new approach to corporate governance, Tyrell found himself caught up in the vision. This was more than just damage control or image rehabilitation. This was a chance to fundamentally reimagine what a corporation could be, what it could do for society. "It won't be easy," Elijah concluded. "We'll face resistance from the board, from shareholders, maybe even from some of our own executives. But I think it's worth fighting for. What do you say, brother? Ready to shake things up even more?" Tyrell grinned, extending his hand. "Let's do it," he said, as they shook on their new pact. Collins Associates 2.0, better, stronger, more ethical than ever. As they rejoined their mothers, sharing their excitement about the new plans, Tyrell felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. The past year had been about healing, about finding his place in the Collins legacy. Now it was time to look to the future, to build something truly revolutionary. The challenges ahead were daunting, but Tyrell felt ready to face them. He had his brother by his side, the unwavering support of their mothers, and a clear vision of what they wanted to achieve. Together, they would write the next chapter of the Collins story, one of redemption, innovation, and positive change. As they stepped out into the cool night air, saying their goodbyes, Tyrell looked up at the city skyline. The Collins Associates building stood tall among the others, no longer a symbol of secrets and regret, but a beacon of possibility. Tomorrow they would begin the work of transforming that possibility into reality. With a final wave to his family, Tyrell set off towards home, his mind already racing with ideas and plans. The future was unwritten, full of challenges and opportunities, and he was ready more than ever to meet it head-on. The story of Tyrell Grant, once the secret son of Richard Collins, had evolved into something far greater than he could have imagined. It was no longer just his story, or even just the Collins family's story. It was becoming a story of corporate responsibility, of ethical leadership, of the power of truth and reconciliation. As Tyrell walked through the city streets, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. The pain of the past had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into a driving force for positive change. He was no longer defined by what had been done to him, but by what he chose to do for himself, for his family, and for the countless lives touched by Colin's associates. The night was full of promise, and tomorrow was waiting to be shaped. Tyrell Grant, once an outsider, was now at the heart of a transformation that could ripple out far beyond the walls of Colin's associates. And he was ready for whatever came next. In the end, our legacy isn't defined by the mistakes we've made, but by how we choose to rectify them. Tyrell's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when betrayal and abandonment threaten to consume us, there's always a path to redemption. The true measure of our character lies not in avoiding hardship, but in how we rise above it. Tyrell and Elijah's story isn't just about corporate transformation, it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the strength we find in unexpected places. Remember, every scar you bear is a reminder of your strength. Every tear you've shed has watered the seeds of your growth. Like Amara, who raised her son in the face of adversity, you too have the power to turn pain into purpose. In the end, it's not about the family we're born into, but the family we choose to build. It's about the love that sustains us, the truth that frees us, and the courage to face our past so we can reshape our future. Your story, like Tyrell's, is still being written. And no matter how dark the chapters have been so far, you have the power to change the narrative. You are not defined by the wrongs done to you, but by the rights you choose to do. So stand tall, embrace your truth, and know that every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory. Your past does not dictate your future. Like the new Collins associates, you too can rise from the ashes of betrayal and build something beautiful, something that touches lives and leaves the world a little better than you found it. Remember, in the tapestry of life, even the darkest threads have their purpose. They make the bright ones shine all the brighter. Your struggles, your tears, your resilience, they all matter. You matter. You matter. And your story, with all its pain and triumph, has the power to inspire and heal others. So keep going, keep loving, keep forgiving. For in the end, it's not about winning or losing. It's about how we choose to live our story. And your story, like Tyrell's, has the power to change the world.